I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, which I'm giving this presentation from, which, like Deborah's, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present on what is and always was Aboriginal land. I'm also, in addition to that role, I've been the union's representative on the International Trade Remedies Forum, which is an advisory body, tripartite advisory body, which Damien's involved with at the ACTU and a number of other unions, the AMWU and the AWU, provide advice to the Australian government on Australia's anti-dumping and countervailing system. This is the paper that we tabled when we had the opportunity, like a number of others on this call, had to address the negotiators at the round of negotiations in Melbourne. So it's a pretty simple paper, but it reflects the principles that is really a industry position in Australia, both employers and unions. And it basically outlines the view that the anti-dumping and countervailing system shouldn't be fiddled with in bilateral and regional trade agreements. So you'll see at the top there, we've got, the big ticks on it's okay to have a trade remedies chapter which reinforce the rights and obligations of RCEP members under the WTO anti-dumping agreement and the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement and the WTO agreement on safeguards. What we don't like is for the rights and obligations of, well, particularly Australian industry and Australian workers from the perspective that we're taking, but also other RCEP members to have their rights and obligations under those WTO agreements undermined by the terms of agreements in trade agreements, the terms of agreements in trade remedies chapters in agreements. And that's a position which we've discussed with in our global union federations, because there is a growing consensus about the importance of using these tools to foster industrial development and to potentially use them to also protect some of trade unions' objectives, such as workers' rights. So you'll see that that's what was subsequently tabled. I'm wondering, Peter, if you can move to the next version.
Yep.
The next version was provided to partners and also Australian negotiators. So I don't know if anyone can spot the difference, but there's a little bit more detail in terms of what specifically should not be included in the trade remedies chapter.
Yeah.
And this is basically a mechanism which Australia uses, which it was worst kept secret in the world that China wanted prohibited through the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement negotiations. So it just goes into a little bit more detail to give Australian negotiators and our partners an idea of what to look out for. We didn't table the detailed version because we didn't want to give people ideas. Subsequently, since this, the WTO is actually in a dispute appeals process regarding photocopy paper imported from Indonesia, has said that this method is WTO compliant, this method of determining normal value. So did we have success? So drawing people's attention to the chapter itself, certainly it doesn't prohibit this sort of normal value determination. which is used to determine a dumping margin. However, there are some elements of the agreement in the trade remedies chapter, which are what we'd call WTO plus. The most obvious one is the notification period, which the chapter suggests that there needs to be a 20-day notification period prior to the initiation of an investigation to the exporting country. Compared to the TPP, that was a 7-day notification period. And compared to the WTO anti-dumping agreement, it just says you need to notify them before initiating the investigation. It doesn't dictate a time period. It's probably not the smartest thing to do, to give massive notification, certainly 20 days. That period would ultimately be used to potentially engage in intermittent dumping. So to increase exports and volumes of exports in that time, which could cause material injury to domestic industry. And it could also be used to dissuade, at attempts to dissuade the launching of that investigation. The other peculiarity in the agreement is a prohibition on what's known as zeroing. So essentially, in an anti-dumping investigation, when you were to calculate the dumping margin, what you'd usually do is calculate the normal value, which is the price of the good sold in the export country, or the reasonable cost of production, with the export prices. The difference of that normal value and the export prices would be the dumping margin, which would determine the level of dumping duty or tariff. What the United States does is, when considering those exports, instead of considering the trade weighted average of the goods under consideration for the investigation period, they'll only consider the goods which were imported at a dump price. For goods that were imported that weren't dumped, what they'll do is they'll essentially discount that or zero it or not include them in the trade weighted average. Ultimately, that increases the dumping margin significantly. Australia or none of the RCEP countries do that. And for years and years and years, the United States have been defended this methodology for determining dumping margin in the WTO. And the last investigation, the last determination from the WTO was essentially that they were able to do this, although they criticised elements of how they went about it. And a curious inclusion in the agreement, which prohibits zeroing, designed more for geopolitical and global trade considerations, particularly in light of the China-US trade war. So that was peculiar as well. Like other parts of the agreement, the trade remedies chapter is not binding, or there's no dispute mechanism associated with it. Just to touch base on one other element of the trade remedies agreement, you'll see there that we also give a tick to the inclusion of clauses establishing bilateral safeguard mechanisms. So these are essentially included in agreements so that following tariff reductions, if there's a surge of imports which causes serious injury to a domestic industry, that temporary emergency tariffs can be put back in place up to the level of the tariff reduction dictated by the agreement. I think, as I outlined earlier, we're generally supportive of this because it provides domestic industries with suitable protection. And it's important because the WTO agreement on safeguards has the same provisions, but it can't be applied exclusively to one particular country. So it needs to be applied across the board following a surge of imports. How this would effectively work in the Australian context, though, where we're not essentially offering tariff reductions as part of this agreement with any of the current partners, although potentially others that include it, basically makes it defunct. Another reason why it would be essentially defunct in the Australian context is that the competent authority for administrating Australia's safeguard system is the Productivity Commission, who essentially would not countenance the provision of safeguard duties, emergency tariffs on any goods on public interest grounds. It's kind of peculiar about Australia's system because no other countries in RCEP or essentially globally have a similar body administering their safeguard system. So it's been the long-standing position of our unions, and I think we're able to talk to the Labor Party into it prior to the last election, that that role from the Productivity Commission would be stripped and provided to the Anti-Dumping Commission, consistent with best global practice. But that continues to be an ongoing campaign.